She is co-author of the book The Filipino Saga, History as a Social Change. She received 2 international research scholarships, the first from the Fulbright Program of the United States State Department in 2002, and the second from the Rockefeller Foundation in 2003, which enabled her to do research at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York. She served as president of the Philippine Historical Association, the Honorary Professional Association of Historians of the Philippines. She was former chief of the Research, Publications, and Heraldry Division of the National Historical Institute, now the National Historical Commission of the Philippines. So maybe without any further ado, may we call on Dr. Celestina Boncan. Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning to all. Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. Kahit na umuulan, nandito tayo. Morning. And I'm glad to be here. Well, I'm used to having teachers, public and private, attending conferences where I am speaker. But it's my first time to be in the company of seafarers. It's such a novel idea for me, a novel experience, at natutuwa po ako na nandito po ako sa konferensya nito sa umagang nito. Before I start my lecture today, I would like first of all to congratulate the Asian Institute of Maritime Studies for holding this second National Forum on Philippine Maritime Heritage, in particular, Dr. Arlene Paderanga, President of AIMS, Dr. Felicito Dalagete, Senior Vice President, Mr. Ronald Vinsania, Executive Director, and of course, my very good friend, Mr. Jasper Gandito, Museo Maritimo Jurídico. As we are a nation of seafarers, it is imperative for us Filipinos to take stock of our rich maritime heritage and make this as one of the characteristic features of the Philippines in the global world. Allow me also to thank you for the invitation to be a speaker in this forum. The outline of my lecture is as follows. First, I will give an introduction to the founding of Manila as a Spanish city. Then the main part of my lecture is Manila as a port, followed with Manila as a port, and then with my conclusion. This topic is very close to my heart because way back in 1979, I was still a fresh graduate from the UP. My second job actually was as researcher for the Intramuros administration. I was right there when Intramuros was being restored. And I was part of this great project of the government to restore Intramuros. I saw with my very own eyes how heavily damaged Intramuros was because of the Second World War. And the different projects undertaken by government to restore portions of the wall, especially Fort Santiago. First, the founding of Manila as a Spanish city. Probably most of you are familiar with this portion, the founding of Manila as a Spanish city. Well, Manila was founded as a Spanish city by Spanish conquistador Miguel López de Legazpi on June 24, 1571. for which the city of Manila continues to celebrate its founding until today. On this day, he created Manila's first cabildo or city council. Until today, June 24, is a very important day in Manila, and it is known as Araw ng Maynila, a holiday. So, actually, Legazpi's Manila was a thriving native settlement called Manila, located near the mouth of the Pasig River and named after the Milan plant, which grew there in abundance on the marshes of the Pasig River. Manila was ruled by native chieftains called Rakas, like Rakas Suliman, the ruler of Manila in 1571, who traced their ancestry to the Rakas of Borneo, especially northern Borneo, the area of Brunei today. After founding Manila, Legazpi began to build the Spanish city following a set of rules known as the ordinances concerning discoveries, settlements, and pacification of the Indies, which laid down the design of Spanish towns and cities to be founded in the New World for America and the East Indies for Asia. So you will notice that this basic design consisted of a compact layout whereby streets crisscross from north to south and from east to west, creating in the process square or rectangle building lots. The typical Spanish colonial city had a principal open space called Plaza Mayor in the shape of a square. So these are examples of Spanish colonial cities founded in the Caribbean. For example, the city of Santo Domingo in Hispaniola. Then you have other cities. This is San Juan in Puerto Rico. And Manila also followed the design, which is usually called the grid iron or the checkerboard pattern of Spanish colonial cities built during this period. According to Antonio de Boncan, Lieutenant Governor of Manila in 1603, Manila complied with this design because Manila was laid out with well-arranged streets and squares. A sufficiently large main square called Plaza Mayor was left, from which were erected the Cathedral Church and municipal buildings. There was another square very near the river, which was called Plaza de Armas, which eventually faced the future Fort Santiago. The houses of the Cabildo, on the other hand, were located on the main square. The houses of the Cabildo are the buildings on the left side of our illustration here. The houses of the Cabildo are built of stone according to this 1603 account. On the ground floor is the prison and the court of the mayors. On the same square is situated the Cathedral Church at the center, which today is the Manila Cathedral. Among others, the streets of Manila were named after Spanish explorers. like Magallanes. So there is a Calle Magallanes and a Calle Legazpi in Manila. Then you have also streets named after governors general like Pasco and Anda. So you will notice that this naming of streets in Manila were for the glorification of Spain. Because from here you can see the connection being placed in this new colony of Spain in the Philippines. The founding of Manila as a Spanish city on the site of Raja Soliman's old Manila had a very disappointing impact because it displaced Filipinos under the new colonial setup. Because the Filipinos were driven away from Manila and they built new settlements across the Pasig River. In the centuries to come, the Pasig River will serve as the natural boundary between Spaniards and Filipinos. From the old Tondo of Rajas Patanta and Raja Lacandula at the downstream of the Pasig River, and the areas on the upstream of the Pasig River, such as Binondo, Tondo, Santa Cruz, and Quiapo, now became the new residential enclaves and centers of intra-regional trade by Filipinos and later on by migrant Chinese merchants. These new areas of settlement began with a few isolated hamlets. But by the 19th century, the number of houses in Tondo, in Binondo, in Santa Cruz, and Quiapo, the number of stores and other urban structures, likewise the population had more than doubled. In 1859, they were made a part of Manila as its arrabales or suburbs. Now we come to Manila as a port. Manila was not just a Spanish colonial city. It was a recinto or a fortified city. Manila was designed to be an enclave for Spaniards. Manila was principally built for Spaniards. As such, foremost in the minds of the Spaniards was their safety. On one hand, from unpacified and rebellious natives, and from rival European powers like the Portuguese and the Dutch. Central to this concept was the construction of an invincible defense system founded first on a formidable stone fort. Legazpi began building a fort for the defense of his newly established Spanish city. The fort was located at the area nearest the point where the waters of the Pasig River met the waters of Manila Bay. It was initially built of coconut tree trunks held together by mounds of earth. So it was just a very simple fort. But the fort had a brand name, and its name was Santiago. Became known as Fort Santiago after the patron saint of Spain, Saint James the Greater. In Spain, you have a great city in the northwest known as Santiago de Compostela. The usefulness of the fort as a defense of Manila was put to a test in 1574. On November 30 of this year, a Chinese invasion force headed by Kim Makong aboard 70 ships reinforced with artillery arrived. The Chinese attacked Manila for 3 days, but eventually withdrew to Pangasinan, where they were defeated by the forces led by Juan de Salcedo. For the loyalty to Spain demonstrated by the city of Manila, King Philip II gave Manila the title of Muy Noble y Siempre Leal, meaning to say distinguished and ever loyal. In 1596, Philip II again honored Manila by bestowing to the city its own coat of arms. It is still very much the same as the logo of the city of Manila today. Convinced of the imperative need for a much stronger fort for the city, the Spaniards began building a new fort made of a stronger material, which is stone. Construction of the new stone fort was begun in 1590 by Governor General Gomez Perez Dasmariñas. Construction work to place Fort Santiago in constant readiness for the defense of Manila continued until the end of the 19th century. The task of maintaining Fort Santiago was placed on succeeding governors general. This is a project for the repair and further improvement of Fort Santiago in 1771. This one is a project for the repair in 1824 and another one in 1890. After the Limahong invasion, succeeding governors general began to put up a wall around Manila, which began initially made of palisade during the time of Governor General Guido de la Besares and Francisco de Sande. But later on, sometime around 1585, the wall began to be made of stone already. This was during the time of Governor General Santiago de Vera and Gomez Perez Dasmariñas. Because it was now surrounded by stone, a wall made of stone, Manila came to be called Intramuros, for the city within the walls. Various kinds of defense works were built along Manila's stone wall, such as a fortil or a small fort, a bastion, this is a bastion, which was also called baluarte, or a structure protruding from the main wall, and also a baluartillo, which was a small bastion. The stone wall was further defended by outer defense works such as a reducto, which defended a bastion or a baluarte, and a revelin, which defended a gate. Spanish military engineers were even brought to the Philippines to improve the fortifications of Manila during the 18th century. For example, Feliciano Marquez, Tomas Sanz, Dionisio O'Kelly, and Miguel Antonio Gomez. These are examples of a project of these Spanish military engineers. Two rings of moat surrounded Intramuros, a fosso and a contrafosso, and the water came from the Pasig River. So Manila was just like the cities and castles in Spain during this period. At all hours of the day and night, soldiers guarded these forts, bastions, and redoubts. High-caliber cannons rested on top of the stone wall, ready to be fired their fatal ammunition. Even adding to the defense was the destruction of the small villages, small towns, and hamlets just outside of Intramuros, where you now find SM Manila, where you find Manila City Hall, and all the way to Luneta. At this time, in the 18th century, there were small towns there, but since they were places from where enemy assaults could be initiated, these were brought down and demolished. Another defense measure of the Spaniards was limiting the entry of Filipinos in going to Intramuros. Remember that Intramuros was only for the Spaniards, but then Filipinos would be allowed to enter during the day because it is the Filipinos who work for the Spaniards, being servants, laundry women, or even carriage drivers. So this is Puerta del Parian, the gate where people coming from the eastern part of Manila can enter the Intramuros. The next, this is Puerta Isabel, for those people coming from the river. And another gate where Filipinos can enter the Intramuros was Puerta de Santa Lucia. And this is for people coming from the bayside. The defense of Manila even extended to the south, outside already of the perimeter of Manila. And I am speaking of what you would call the Cavite Peninsula. Cavite Peninsula is the stretch of land protruding to Manila Bay. Cavite Peninsula was already very important to the government because it was there where the government maintained its arsenal as well as the biggest shipyard. Fort San Felipe, towards the end of the peninsula, marked there by a square and outward bastions, was built not only to defend the government's arsenal and shipyard, but also to defend the sea approach to Manila. This is Fort San Felipe. It is now part of the Philippine Navy and restricted to the Philippine Navy only. Manila as port. What are the consequences of Manila as port? One was to make Manila a target for Dutch incursions in the Philippines. In the first half of the 17th century, the Philippines was fought in the middle of what we would call the Spanish-Dutch Wars because the Spaniards were trying to get the Moluccas, which angered the Dutch because they were already firmly based there. So the Dutch would come all the way to the Philippines and bringing with them a very large squadron of ships threatening the security of Manila. For nearly half a century, Spanish Manila lived in constant threat of the Dutch. The Dutch menace recalled memories of how they drove away the Portuguese from the Moluccas, considering that the Portuguese were the first to arrive in the Moluccas, but then the Dutch drove them away. Fearing the same thing to happen in the Philippines, the Spaniards in Manila took every means to prevent a Dutch takeover. Another consequence of Manila as port connected with the Dutch threat is the raising of the demand for polo y servicio. Polo y servicio is the required labor service to Filipinos. One labor service that Filipinos rendered for the government is the construction of ships. And before you can construct ships, you have to cut timber. So many Filipinos would be sent to mountain regions, especially the Sierra Madre mountains, to cut timber, and the timber would be brought to Cavite, the country's principal shipyard, to be constructed into galleons. Because it was galleons or ships that the government needed during this period of Dutch naval battles. The increase of the polo y servicio made Filipinos rise in revolt, such as the revolt that happened in Samar in 1649, led by Agustin Sumoroy. During this year, Governor General Diego Fajardo sent an order to the menfolk of Samar that they were required to move to Cavite to build consequence of this going to Cavite? Well, it would mean that the men of Visayas or Samar would have to spend nearly 6 months of the year just in Cavite. What will happen to their families and to their farms if the men are absent from Samar? So this revolt that started in Samar spread out to other parts of the Visayas. It spread to Bohol, it spread to Cebu, it went even up to Masbate, to Sorsogon, and Albay in Luzon, and downwards in Mindanao, in Zamboanga, and other parts of northern Mindanao. This Sumuroy revolt was very significant because it was regarded as the first widespread revolt of Philippines. So it was nearly encompassing the major regions of the country. Manila as port. The founding of Manila gave the Spaniards a well-placed capital. Well-placed capital because the initial capital of the Philippines was Cebu. But Cebu was very vulnerable to Portuguese and Dutch attacks. So Legazpi wanted to look for another place where he could put or install the capital. And that capital has come to be Manila. Aside from being much farther away from attacks by the Portuguese, Manila was conveniently located on the path of trade routes used for centuries by Southeast Asian trade merchants. So the white dotted line will tell you where the Southeast Asian merchants, especially the Chinese, traversed in these waters of Southeast Asia. Eventually, the trade started by the Spaniards was a trade between Manila and Acapulco in Mexico. And the principal product of the trade is Asian merchandise. Asian merchandise such as the following: silk products, cotton cloth, gold thread, musk. There are porcelain wares, earthen jars and crockery, and even fine furniture, clothes, and textile. The principal transporters of this trade were ships called galleons. They were sturdy wooden ships capable of crossing the vast Pacific Ocean. The galleons were made here in the Philippines. They were made in shipyards, for example, in Cavite and in Sorsogon, especially in the towns of Donsol and Pilar. You have a group of archaeologists from the National Museum who have been conducting archaeological excavations in Sorsogon, and so far they have found evidences that indeed there was an astillero or a shipyard in Sorsogon. The galleons, aside from being made here in the Philippines, used the very best timber, and this is Philippine timber, such as Molave, Dumon, Palo Maria, Baticolin, Banaba, and many more. Now, news of the great demand for Asian luxurious merchandise in Mexico attracted merchants of various nationalities to come to Manila, in effect making Manila an entrepot of trade, meaning to say a center of trade. Now, one of the consequences of the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade was the promise of great profits, because these Asian merchandise were easily sold in Acapulco. So any Spanish merchant investing in the galleon trade was assured of huge profits once the galleon makes its return trip to Manila. This promise of great profits made Spanish officials focus greater attention to the galleon trade rather than to the development of Philippine agriculture, resulting in the impoverishment of Philippines. The galleon trade that the Spaniards developed was the trade that brought Asian merchandise to America and from there to Europe instead of the products of the Philippines. During these centuries, from the 17th up to the 18th century, the Philippine economy experienced an underdevelopment, leading to the impoverishment of many Filipinos. Many Filipinos did not invest in the galleon trade, so they remained farmers, they remained fishermen, and doing menial jobs. The Manila-Acapulco galleon trade brought the money of Mexico, which are called reales, to the Philippines. That is another consequence of Manila as a port. Now, what was the influence of these Mexican reales to the Philippine economy? Well, basically, they transformed the Philippine economy from being barter-based to money-based because the reales now became the medium of exchange among Filipinos. So here in our illustration, we see a typical scene in the market where instead of exchanging product for a product or barter, people were now using money, the Mexican reales, as their medium of exchange. As an entrepot of trade, another consequence to Manila was the attraction of Chinese merchants to settle in Manila. Thereby, Manila became a center of a large migrant Chinese population. Initially, the Chinese were transient merchants. They would come to Manila and bring down their trade products and then leave. But now, here, during the period of the galleon trade, they were welcomed by the Spaniards because they brought in the products that would be sold in Acapulco. Not only that, the Chinese were experienced craftsmen. They knew how to silversmithing. They were pharmacists, they were barbers, they were tailors. So these are services that the Spaniards in Manila required. Now, these Chinese merchants soon dominated the very vital retail trade in Manila. Because there were so many, at one point there were about 10,000 of them, whereas the Spaniards were only 2,000. The Spaniards feared for their safety. So what they did was to require the Chinese to live in an exclusive quarters that has come to be known as Parian. The Parian initially was established in the area where you have today arroceros because that is one of the traits of the Chinese. They were rice growers. So arroceros street is where rice was being sold by the Chinese. Later on, the Parian was removed from that area and transferred to Philippine. The Parian was a two-story building. It was octagonal in shape. The first floor is where we find the stores, and on the second floor you have the living quarters, much very similar today. So one of the impact of a large migrant population of Chinese merchants is the dominance of the retail trade in Manila. They overshadowed native Filipino trade and even craftsmanship. conclusion, the twin developments of Manila as port and Manila as port were the creations of colonialism. The characteristic features of Manila as port and Manila as port were in consonance with Spain's policy in the 16th century, which was to explore, to discover, and to conquer for the purpose of bringing gold and glory to Spain. So this founding of Manila was during this very important period in Spanish history when they were looking for wealth. The Spaniards turned Manila into a bastion city to serve as an exclusive enclave far from the reach of natives whom they relocated to the other side of the Pasig River. Even as Intramuros, their stone enclave was already set apart from where Filipinos lived by means of a natural boundary, the Pasig River. They still set up a perimeter of exclusivity by building a wall of stone to separate themselves from the native populace. So it was not just a natural boundary, the Pasig River, separating the Spaniards from the Filipinos, but a physical boundary, something that you cannot touch. And this was the stone wall. And even before the stone wall, you have the moat. Because, as I said earlier, Manila or Intramuros was surrounded by 2 layers of moat, of water, preventing Filipinos to come near the Spaniards. The Spaniards made Manila into an entrepot of trade in Asia, but for which no great advantage accrued to native Filipinos. The trade that Manila engendered as port was a trade that did not develop the local economy nor bring the products of the country to America, but instead it was the goods of foreign nations like China, like Japan, like India, which were the goods brought to Mexico that the Spanish galleons brought right to the doorsteps of Mexico. In 1896, Spain's impregnable recinto proved to be so insurmountable to the katipunan forces of Andres Bonifacio, who were unable to lodge even a fighting chance to topple Spanish power, forcing Andres Bonifacio to wage the revolution's initial battles in places that were too far away, such as San Juan del Monte, Santa Mesa, Caloocan, Pasig, and Taguig. Today, the famed bastion city of Manila is no more. Neither is it close to Filipinos, and any Filipino can enter Intramuros today. Starting in the 19th century, the entrepot distinction of Manila was already beginning to decline in the light of the rise of new entrepot, which heretofore were merely small fishing villages. Singapore, on the tip of the Malay Peninsula, and Hong Kong on the southern coast of China, in the 19th century were raised to the status of entrepots by another European colonizing power, Great Britain. Singapore was so small a fishing village, and it was begun by the British to rival a nearby entrepot, which is Batavia. Today it is Jakarta. Today, Spain's former entrepot of trade, Manila, cannot rely simply on her famed sunset by the bay to bring in foreign trade. Manila has to compete with other entrepots, other than Singapore and Hong Kong, that have in this age of global trade risen to the challenge to bring not only Asian but also North American, European, and even Middle Eastern trade. That is the competition that Manila faces with ASEAN. Maraming salamat po. Thank you.